Salut YouTube, let's talk about Emily in Paris Season 2. So this video I want to give you a little bit of a review of the series, how I feel it has evolved or not evolved at all, what they got right, what they got wrong, and along the way bring up some truths or some culture shocks that triggered in me. I think with the series, the reason that I can't not watch is that I was Emily in Paris. Like, I was this foreigner who came to France, not speaking a word of French, landed at LVMH, the Louis Vuitton Moët Hennessy group, had this crazy experience in the world of luxury and was just a fish out of water. And so I find it really fascinating from that perspective. I do find it really interesting in general how controversial this series is. So I've seen everything from it's really shallow and superficial, it's a dystopian reality, all the way to like chill, it's a bit of fun, you see gorgeous landscapes and you're able to just blob out, all the way to it's extremely problematic, it's xenophobic, and the lack of black female representation, for example, or the way that they portrayed the Ukrainian girl and had her shoplifting and things like that, let alone how they treat French people and the cliches there. All in all is actually quite damaging. All right, so let's look at some of the moments from throughout Emily in Paris Season 2 that made me think, oh, okay, I need to talk about that one. And just before we do, something that was really well done is Emily struggling to learn French, right? It takes longer than you ever expect, it's harder than you expect, and the mistakes that she was making was so funny because they were the really classic mistakes that we all make when we have to learn a language. And it showed Emily going to these French classes in Paris after hours, doing these awful exercises like where you have to present your partner who you're sitting next to and things like that. And it really made me laugh because that journey to learning French was so hard. But something that did change the game for me in terms of me being able to learn French was shifting it from physical classes that I had to rush to, commute to, and do a fixed amount of times per week to learning online. And if one of your New Year's resolutions this year is to learn a language, learn French, learn English, business English, Spanish, or German, I definitely recommend our friends over at Lingoda. And what's really exciting, this is very time sensitive by the way, is they are running their famous Lingoda sprint for the start of the year. And the sprint is actually the perfect way for you to stick to your New Year's resolutions because it uses the science of habit formation. So it's a very intensive language learning challenge. You can either take 15 classes per month for 2 months or 30 classes per month for 2 months. And the coolest thing is if you attend all of your classes, if you show up for yourself, Lingoda reward you with cashback. So you can get 50% cashback for the 15 classes per month or 100% cashback for the 30 classes per month, only for 2 months. Seriously, over 40,000 people have participated in Lingoda sprints, heaps of my subscribers have, and it's such a good way to build those habits and get conversational really fast and build so much confidence in the language. You will see such a dramatic improvement. It's fully online, native professors, amazing curriculum materials. You can learn from anywhere, anytime that suits you, so that flexibility is key to you sticking to your schedule. And you can even work your way towards a certificate at the end of each level that is recognized in loads of different institutions as well. It's very motivating. The platform's so clean and so easy to use. It was just the best thing I ever invested in terms of learning French. So if you want to sign up to the sprint, you have to move now because registrations will close on the 1st of February and classes start on February 11th. Kick the year off with a bang with this amazing 60-day language learning challenge. You've got nothing to lose and everything to gain, and you may even get your cash back. I mean, how cool is that? So click the link below, use my voucher code Rosie2022 and go and speak better French than Emily. Okay, so I obviously couldn't discuss the Emily in Paris thing without talking about her outfits. That's something that I was really surprised didn't change actually. In fact, they were sort of louder and more outrageous than ever before. And I get it, the fashion is a core part of the show and it gets people talking, but it's just not French, right? It looks like it's come from Sex and the City, it looks very New York, or for me as a New Zealander looking in very like celebrity, right? Very Hollywood. I do think it's a little bit of a shame, like all of the makeup is very French, but the outfits just wouldn't work. And that's not what people are wearing in these big luxury groups. I've been there firsthand. They don't usually wear these bright, flashy, over-the-top things. Maybe they have a bright pair of heels or a blazer. They may have a statement piece, but they do not dress like that. And from my experience being an expat living in France, all of us expat girls eventually adapted to the style, right? We all started being quite low-key and muted with our hair, with our clothing, with our makeup. and I was kind of expecting Emily to go in that direction as well. One thing I will say about Emily's hair is that it's so perfectly coiffed and very tidy, and these very structured almost coils in her waved hair. That's not the French way. The French woman way, when their hair is down, is a lot more natural and lightly tousled as well. So again, I was a little bit surprised to not see that change. And I have to say, honestly, never ever ever would a French girl wear this. I couldn't believe it when I saw Camille out wearing this. Not that the actress doesn't look gorgeous, but it's just not what a French girl would wear. Really emphasizing the boobs, having lots of cleavage. Like, French women show their legs, so they might wear a shorter sort of dress, or their backs. The chest isn't out. That's not something that they do a lot of. Moving into another thing that was a little bit problematic about the first season, which kind of continued in the second season but got a little bit better, was this thing around the real Paris, or even the real France. Like, very early on into the season, Emily goes off to Saint-Tropez. Everything's very luxury. It's the nicest restaurants, it's the champagne, it's the boats. She's friends with Camille, they go to Champagne together. It's very, very luxury life. And I sort of thought to myself, like, where are the men approaching you on the street being like, Madame, Madame, tu as un 06? Like, you know, the young guys like asking for your number and harassing you on the streets. Like, there's just not that dirtiness, right? There's not the loudness, grunginess, dirtiness, and let's face it, street harassment that exists in Paris. You don't really see any of that stuff. However, I am glad that they introduced Elfie as a character of this classic kind of expat that doesn't want to learn the language, doesn't want to integrate, and doesn't think that Paris is that shit hot after all, because it provided a really nice contrast to Emily. And I feel like through him, they did address that, yes, Paris is both beautiful and can be both also really average to live in. They kind of said it's a mindset thing. It's about how you look at it. And I guess it's a little bit of both. There's duality. There's amazing parts of the city and really crappy parts of the city, and that's just how it is. They coexist. Moving on now into how they kind of tackled French in their relationships. I find this really interesting. Emily's boss in the series is Sylvie, and she's French, probably a woman in her 50s, I would say. And they very much positioned her as this chic, older French woman. And there's a lot of interesting things that they use her for in terms of bringing out certain cliches. So what was quite interesting, and which they got right, is that Emily didn't know a lot about Sylvie for a very long time. Are you married? Do you have kids? Like, she didn't know anything like that. And there comes a point where Emily accidentally stumbles across Sylvie and her husband in the south of France. And Sylvie kind of has an outburst and she says, we've been married a long time, we don't live together, and we don't have any kids. Are you happy now? And that was quite true in that, you know, French people don't give away those details very easily, but they really portrayed Sylvie in this like super modern relationship where, you know, she's married and she loves the man, but she's in Paris for her career, so it's an open marriage, and she starts dating younger men. And although I loved the dynamic between having those relationships of an older woman and a younger man, I do think it was a little bit over the top of that cliche of like, the French are so open. Marriage, what's that? And another moment where this happened is where Camille was telling her parents that Emily and Gabrielle had slept together and therefore cheated on her. And her dad says something with the wife standing right there to the effect of, oh, you know, it's just a test, that kind of thing. Isn't it, sweetie? You know, cheating affairs, it's simply a test. You come out stronger. I've done a whole video on this about whether or not I think French people cheat more often than the average. I'll definitely link it here. I think it's interesting, but it very much debunks this. Coming into communication in general, what I thought they didn't do quite well was sometimes that address topics really directly, whereas the French are very indirect and second degree. And so, for example, colleagues are out for lunch and they just asked Emily like, oh, are you sleeping with Gabrielle? Like, that wouldn't really happen. You don't talk about, again, that private life stuff as much. And even if you do, it would be a sort of subtle, I know if you know what I mean, hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And just like when Emily accidentally took one of the accounts from her colleague and he turned around and said, we are competitors now. I mean, that wouldn't happen. It's a lot more subtle. Much more like the scene where Emily walked into the meeting and Camille was angry at her because she'd slept with her boyfriend. And Camille just didn't even acknowledge her presence and kept speaking to Sylvie. That's more like it. Like, don't even acknowledge you. and then sitting down for the meeting and Emily starts presenting in English, asking if the meeting can be turned to French. That's much more the French style. Now going into more sort of general behavior and culture shocks that it made me think of. The first, when Luke takes Emily to the cinema and asks if she wants to share some popcorn, I found that quite funny because it reminded me of a huge cultural difference, which is for us, when we go to the cinema, we get popcorn and an ice cream. We're not hungry, it's not about need, it's not about feeding yourself, it's just about pleasure. And it's automatic. You almost have to. Like you get popcorn and some lollies or popcorn and ice cream. Whereas at the cinema in France, 9 times out of 10, you'll go with your French friends and you'll be like, oh, should we get some popcorn? And they're like, j'ai pas faim, like I'm not hungry, I'm fine, and you're like, okay then. And it's so funny, that is not an automatic thing, and I did many a movie without popcorn and it was really bizarre for me. The second thing, because there's a whole storyline about busking in Paris, it made me think about the buskers in Paris that I've never really discussed on this channel, which I found really interesting, which is when you're down on the metro, I mean there's a lot of buskers in Paris of course, but on the metro you get a very specific type, and there's this type where they bring almost like this speaker, like kind of boombox thing and a microphone, and they'll come into your metro carriage and they'll start singing songs, like sometimes really badly, like can you imagine Chandelier being sung by a French guy who can't really sing and doesn't know the words. This is a real fascinating thing, and everyone's kind of like avoiding eye contact because once they finish their little song, they come around asking for change. And then the metro stops at the next stop, they hop out and they try the next carriage. I thought that was just a funny thing that I don't think I've ever discussed before on the channel. The other thing is that yet again, Sylvie was caught smoking in the office, and unless this is like a small family operated boutique or whatever, like this would never happen in a professional digital agency. If French people want to smoke, and they do smoke a lot, they go to the rooftop, they go on the terrace, they go downstairs, and if they really don't have any of those options, sometimes you can catch French people smoking, you know, leaning out the balcony on the window, but they're not smoking in the room in your face. I loved that they brought up the air conditioning thing. That was so funny because that's something I've spoken about on this channel before. French people hate air conditioning. They believe that it causes sore necks, it gives you colds and all of this kind of thing, and they're very anti it. And it's so funny because you get this big heat wave in Paris, and at the same time everyone suddenly accepts that they could use a fan, and they go to get a fan and they are sold out across the entire city. And I don't doubt that air conditioning can be linked to giving you colds, but I don't think it's as common as the French thing. Another thing that made me laugh was the stick car. So Emily got in to drive, it was an emergency, and it was a stick, like a manual car, and she's like, ah, it's a stick. And that's so true. Like I learnt to drive and I got my full license with an automatic car. You can do that in New Zealand, and there are loads of manual stick cars in France. They seem to prefer them for whatever reason, and it's true that I feel a little bit stuck sometimes when I'm visiting my in-laws because I can't just borrow their car all the time because most of them have sticks. I really need to learn how to drive a stick, but it's one of those things that it's like, when is that going to happen? Another thing that I thought was quite interesting is how they brought up the boundaries around work and life in terms of being able to be contacted. It is true that there's a French law that came in which gives you the right to disconnect, which means that you are under no obligation whatsoever, and you shouldn't contact people on the weekends, reply on the weekends, and that kind of stuff. Again, theory versus reality. If you're working at L'Oreal, I think we all know that you have moments working till 11 p.m, but that's interesting that they touched on that, which is true. Something that also made me really laugh is this little moment where Luke was about to head off on his bike and he almost crashed into someone who was on another bike, and he was like, "Eh oh, regarde où tu vas, connard!" Like, look where you're going, you asshole. And then she's like, okay, see you. And I was like, that is so true. Yes. Like, they captured this. There's like these moments of aggression in France, like where you can just completely go off at someone. It could be the bus driver, it could be on the road, like road rage, bike rage, whatever it is. And then just like nothing happened, get on with your day. Like they can go from whoa to like chill in a split second. And then the other moment that made me smile and made me think of a culture shock back in France is when Madeline, Emily's boss from the state, turns up and she's like 9 months pregnant. And that made me think of the culture around pregnancy in France. And most French women, like by law, will leave 6 weeks before their due date and go on maternity leave. So you have to use some of your maternity leave, unless you can reach an agreement with your employer. You have to use some of your maternity leave 6 weeks before you even go on maternity leave. You don't often see a French woman about to pop, especially not in a tight leopard print dress in sky-high heels. So in France, you can get signed off from your doctor on sick leave when you're pregnant. I had colleagues who were only 12 weeks pregnant and they were like experiencing back pains and stuff, and like, oh, it's safer if you just get signed off, fully paid sick leave for the rest of their pregnancy. Things like that, you're like, whoa. So that's really good, obviously. I mean, all women should be looked after in that way. I just thought that was a nice subtle way to highlight the difference between that American kind of viewpoint on pregnancy. Like, of course I'm working up until the day before I'm due and owning my pregnant body, and it's here for you to see and all of that kind of stuff, versus the French approach. Speaking of Madeline, one last thing that I did really appreciate about that is that she came in with a very strong American perspective and came to the agency and tried to change things and tighten the ship and make it more streamlined and make it more American, and that didn't work out for her. And I did think it was a really nice way of showing that American way isn't always best, and there was a shift from like the American way was right in season 1, like we do social media better, we're more modern, we do this, to season 2, which is actually like, let's appreciate the French way of doing things. It's different, but it works in its own way. And I was always surprised at that. I was like, how can these giant companies be such a mess inside, be so political, be so unorganized, and it's not like process driven and stuff like that, and yet it works. So there is a little bit of French magic, and they did touch on that in this season, which I appreciated. So I would love to know, what were your impressions of Emily in Paris season 2? What parts stood out for you? Do you think this show merits all of the obsession, all of the discussion, or not? I would love to hear your thoughts down below. It has actually been renewed for season 3 and 4, so whether we like it or not, Emily in Paris is coming back. It will be interesting, I think, to see how it evolves over time. But otherwise, I hope that you enjoyed these insights into my perspective on the whole Emily in Paris season 2 thing. And until next week, when I catch you yet again on the Not Even French YouTube channel, I will say, à bientôt!